Welcome to Leading for Life Stories, Season 3. I'm Bob Judson, I'm the host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Regardless of whether you're a seasoned listener who's been with me since the beginning, or whether you've just dropped in for the occasional episode, I really hope you enjoy the mix of content that I provide, the personal stories, the thematic episodes, and the guests that I have on the show. And I hope you find it all interesting and at least some of it useful. And without further ado, let's go. Welcome back, everybody. My guest this week is Gary Deakin, Major General retired Gary Deakin, CBE, former Army officer, fantastic military career, doing all sorts of really interesting things that you would expect a guy of his kind of caliber to have done, but finishing his career very much in the NATO space with some significant NATO jobs. And we talk about all of that, but we also talk a lot about what he's done since, because since he left, he's equally had some very interesting roles. He was the managing director of GardaWorld for the UK for a while, and has also now built himself much more of a portfolio career doing a range of different things in the consultancy type space. And he's had along the way some really interesting, personal challenging experiences that again I think are very relevant in a leadership sense. So he was a great guest for the podcast, and I really hope you enjoy everything that he has to say. Off we go. Gary, welcome. Thank you very, very much indeed for joining. It's really great to have you on the podcast, and I'm sure based on the knowledge we've got of each other, we'll have a great conversation. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, Bob, thanks for welcoming me on. What a privilege. I've listened to a couple of your other ones, and great stuff. And so I can't quite believe I'm sitting here, actually. But thank you.
No, you richly deserve to sit there. That's for sure. I mean, not least because you've had a fascinating career in the Army, but you've also had a fascinating career beyond the Army in terms of the stuff you're doing, and we'll kind of cover both of those for sure. I think in terms of what you've done, but not least around some of the personal challenges potentially that you've had, and a bit of discussion around transition, which I think is always useful, because those of us that have had to make that journey, I think sometimes people listening to these sort of things that are about to make it or in that process can get some value from it. So we'll definitely feature a bit of that sort of stuff as we go through. But just to kick us off, can you just give a bit of a summary of your career journey as it is?
Yeah, sure. So I spent 3 decades in the British Army, over 3 decades. Started at the lowest level, regimental duty. I went in when I was 18, straight to Santos. I think I was the youngest officer commissioned. And then I moved all the way through the chain of command. I called it the escalator of operations and wars. I was in that generation that just got off one and then got on another, which is, I think, how I ended up being quite senior and finishing off as a major general in NATO. And I kind of branched away from the Army, went into NATO roles, bounced backwards and forwards into command and staff. So that was great fun. I enjoyed it, even though it was very, very challenging at times. I then left about 4 years ago now. That was, as you said, it's not an easy transition. And I moved into the private sector, and I've done leadership roles in security, transformation, risk management. I was UK MD for GardaWorld for a little while. And then I've worked in the tech sector, and now I'm back to business development, working for the latest contract is with a Canadian investment bank. And you couldn't even make that up when I first started this journey.
Yeah, it's funny how the world turns, isn't it, in terms of that sort of stuff. I mean, I remember going to Deloitte, and the first piece of client work I did was with a bank. And I've talked about it before on a different podcast where, it just blew my mind that you want me to do what? I know nothing about this. This is crazy. But, yeah, really interesting. Just early motivations. What took you into the Army in the first place?
I think it was a mix of purpose, excitement and adventure, Bob, I think. I want to be part of something bigger than myself. And my background was quite interesting. I went to a Royal Naval boarding school, because my family was from the Navy. And I was quite shaped by the Falklands War. And I was in my sixth form when the Falklands was on. And I was really inspired by what happened, the expeditionary nature, how they went. And it's probably my first time I was a leader, because, I was a wee house prefect, seeing people put to bed whose fathers were on warships. And indeed, I'll never forget the night HMS Sheffield was hit. And there were 2 boys in the dorm whose fathers were on that warship. And so I think right from the word go, the whole people aspect of conflict and wars kind of lit me up. And then I joined the Army because it was about people. I prefer to fight with the person than the machine. which is what I thought the Navy was. It was all about fighting, as you know, being a fighter pilot. You know, it's a slightly different approach. So
Yeah,
that's what
surely.
motivated me. That's what got me going. And then I remember being inspired by young officers that would come and visit um, the school, and I was thinking, "Oh, I just want to be like one of them." And then I wanted to be a para or marine or something like that initially because that was what the Falklands. But then I went and visited all sorts of different regiments, and the one I eventually joined, which was known as the King's Regiment at the time, I just fell in love with them. You know, the whole spirit, the ethos, the values, and the fun. There was just a lot of fun to be had, you know, and it was a great adventure. So that's kind of got me going. That's how I kind of got into it.
Yeah, and interesting with the Navy background as well, because I do think there is a bit of a sort of service gene that seems to go through some of us. I mean, people often ask me the same question, and I've got quite an army family actually. In terms of my mum was in the WRAC, my got two uncles and a cousin, all of whom were army. And my father was Air Force, but my father died when I was very young, and so you kind of go, well, there must be something in that you've got that kind of connection somehow that brings it in. Interesting what you said about the Falklands. I mean, I was in flying training when the Falklands happened, and I think in common with an awful lot of people, it was kind of where's the Falklands was the first question, because most people, had no idea really that this was, British territory, and but it must have been difficult. I mean, if you actually had, kids you were at school with who were actually, directly affected in that way, particularly when ships sinking and things. I mean, must have been really tough.
It was really interesting because if you think now, like now, you know, remember our experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq and places like that where we instantly can communicate.
Yeah.
Of course, you know, the first news, I'll never forget that 9 o'clock news, you know, and everybody's knew whose father was on what warship, you know, and you were just listening out. And it was just, but that was the first time they heard it. So it's horrendous. And then they wouldn't know for ages whether, you know, who the casualties were they? Because it
That's
was
awful,
so
isn't
far
it?
away.
Yeah, I'd
Yeah.
like to think we're better than that now. I think you're right. I mean, for a long time after that, comms with the Falklands was terrible. I mean, and on operations generally. I can remember when I was running a detachment in Al Kaj in Saudi Arabia in 1998, so a long time after that, and we had the kind of 10 minutes a week welfare call home, whatever the deal was at the time, on a really rubbish line that you could guarantee in the last 2 minutes of it will be when all the news from home was bad and it was a bit of a disaster. And
Yeah.
you think, my goodness, how different it is now with kind of email and WhatsApp and FaceTime and all those kind of communications that people have obviously got access to. But which I think it's a two-edged sword, though, isn't it? It's in some ways, if you're on operations, I think the separation from everything back home was quite helpful in some ways, because it didn't mean you had an extra set of stuff to worry about. Whereas I think if you've got particularly in challenging stuff going on at home, that must focus your mind a little bit.
Yeah, I was thinking about the guys on the subs, on the nuclear subs, you know, just head offshore and don't come back for a long time, and how they manage that. And coming back to the Falklands, I recall going there as young platoon commander for 4 or 5 months, you know, and about 2 years later, you know, as a young second lieutenant, and wow, just being it was a winter. We left a British summer for a Falklands winter via Ascension Island. I do remember because it was the first flight that where a Virgin Atlantic aeroplane was used, you know, chartered
Mm-hmm.
to fly us there because Mount Pleasant Airport, you know, the runway just opened up, so you could get a 747 in there. And it broke down at Ascension, and we were stuck for a couple of days on the equator in July, just delighted. We weren't in a rush. I'll never forget the evening we were flying onwards. This Air Force warrant officer came on the tannoy and reminded everybody that if they were in any way drunk, they would not be allowed to proceed with their trip to the Falkland Islands.
Probably
Which
not
is
the
not
ideal way to phrase it, is it?
it's just not what you say to a couple of hundred soldiers who are going off to winter.
Yeah, exactly.
That
Oh
required
man.
some leadership to make sure we got on that aeroplane, I can tell you.
Yeah, for sure. Right. No drinking. Dear. And of course, in those days as well, it would be a much more hard drinking culture anyhow than perhaps now. I mean, that
Yeah,
certainly was the case in the Air Force. Yeah, I mean, the communications thing amuses me because actually my first marriage was my then fiance was an air traffic controller, and she went to the Falklands. She got back about 5 weeks before we eventually got married, and all through that time, there was no phone calls at all. I mean, it was all blueies, these sort of airmail letters that you'd send, and you had to number them because they'd arrive in different orders.
that's right. I remember doing that. Yeah.
And it's just weird again when you think back to that kind of time, which isn't so long ago. I mean, I know it is if you're 20 something, you look at the Falklands and go, "What? There's some ancient history." but it's it is fascinating how we've moved so much forward from all of that, and I think learned a lot about people caring for the people on operations in particular, and kind of approaching that whole deployment thing, because I just think we were rubbish at it then, to be honest.
Mm. Yeah,
Yeah.
mail was so important, wasn't it? So
Uh,
important to connect. And those blueies that, even though they were quite dated and they would come, arrive in the wrong order and late, whatever, but at least they were just a way of communicating. If you can just write down on one piece of paper what you're feeling and thinking and then put it in the post, they were really quite powerful.
Yeah, definitely so. And I think in some ways better than phone calls, because sometimes phone calls do go wrong, and stuff can, unravel
Mm.
a little bit in terms of the way the call runs. I mean, to your point about the nuclear submarine stuff, I remember one of my penultimate job, actually, I had a military assistant who was a submariner, and we talked quite a lot about the he'd been on both the deterrent boats and on the attack submarines, and they had this sort of family gram thing where inbound, I can't remember how many it is, letters it is a week, so literally as in individual letters that you're allowed as part of your family gram, and it's a really limited number, so you have to compose your message that will then be sent, but obviously is then effectively vetted before you get to see it. And the way you can elect as a an individual on the submarine to either be told bad news or not be told bad news if there is some, because the submarine ain't coming back or surfacing for you, it's just doing its thing. And you get this awful bit where on the final bit of the patrol, when they've actually surfaced and they've handed over and everything else, it's, there'll always be a number of people who are, right, report to the captain's cabin, and one by one they're told that news. And from a leadership point of view, I think that must be really, really tough on the captain, because they're often,
Yeah.
they'll be sitting there with, and some of these are really bad things. People's, children have been killed, or parents have died, or whatever. And usually it involves, that sort of stuff. It's not nothing straightforward, and that must be ghastly to be hanging on to that, seeing people on a regular, pretty much daily basis, and you know not telling them, you're hanging on to this piece of information that is life changing for them, and that must be difficult. I wouldn't have been liked to have been in that position, I don't think.
Yeah, no, 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 really demanding, really demanding. A different type of leadership, I think.
Yeah, very much so. And talking of leadership, I mean, as you know, the podcast's all about leadership. You've had that journey all the way through Sandhurst, doing going all the way to two-star, very, very successful army career with everything that went with that, and then jumping out into the civilian world, and obviously doing some reasonably chunky things outside the military as well. I'm just really interested in your reflections on your own leadership journey initially, the stuff you've learned along the way, what you've how much of that's been unconscious, conscious, how you've changed and adapted your leadership style, what mistakes did you make, and what have you taken from those?
That's a huge question. Where do you begin? And it's funny because I currently coach and mentor. And what I was just reflecting on was, at the moment, I'm a two-star mentor to the what's called the General Staff Development Pathway for the British Army, where future commanders go on an assessment, and then they then get selected to go on a 6-month development pathway, and which they get coaching and mentoring. And I was looking at it thinking, we had none of this, and so it's incredible. How do we adapt and learn? And I think there are a couple of, from my own perspective, there are probably a couple of really big things. I think probably the first one is the other leaders I was around and the other people I was working with or working for. If you go all the way back to the early days at Sandhurst, inspired um, by the young officers, and in our case, again, it comes back to the Falklands. Almost all the senior NCOs had fought in the Falklands, so you were really, you got it firsthand about how important this was to get it right and lead correctly, and out of that, came the whole thing of learning and the lessons learned. Um, and the failures. And I remember my platoon sergeant was on the Sir Galahad,
Oh,
which was a disaster.
yeah,
You know what I
yeah.
mean? And and you had others that were, really so. So I think people and other leaders is really, really important. I've been very privileged. If I think back, I went to Bosnia with Richard Dannett as a brigade commander, James Everard. I mean, these are just great leaders. And we did Bosnia 94, 95. So UNPROFOR into the I4 mission. It was one of my first sort of staff trips. I was privileged enough to work with Nick Orton, Richard Sharef. I went to America and worked with General Lloyd Austin, who'd been the Corps commander in Iraq. I mean, these are great, great leaders, you know, and Austin was an incredible character whose mentor was Henry Kissinger. And in the whole time I worked for him, and the whole time I worked for him for it was 18 months, nearly 2 years, he took one day off. You know, talk about commitment, you know, and we were doing the counter dash campaign. So there's a whole loads of them. I just think so. People, I think, is a really, really, really important. Who you're around and how they, um, how they influence you by, by vicariously learning, I guess. And then that leads into the second big thing, which is the learning. And I think the key to the learning is understanding the context. And if I think of the mistakes you asked me about, I think we learn because we make a mistake, because we mess it up, you know. And normally that's because we've missed the context. We've not really understood what the situation we're in. And one of the key transitions for me was, in the military and in civil industry, actually, if I think about it, you develop a toolkit to solve a problem, and that's the process. But then you may get a problem where that process doesn't work, but you'll still apply it anyway, thinking that's going to be the solution. Really significant. And where I really learned was when I was apt to go off piste almost and go, right, this needs some innovation, this needs to be something different, and being bold enough to do that. And you would be with people that wouldn't like that. You have challenges with, senior officers who thought, what are you doing? But knowing full well that what traditionally would have worked doesn't work because the context had changed. So I think the whole learning thing by doing is pretty important. Of course, on top of that, I mean, I'm very privileged, to have had some great training, great training all the way through, whether it's Sandhurst and, if you Cranwell or, then into command and staff training, company commanders courses, platoon, for me, all the way up to the high commander staff course. And then with a spattering of civilian courses, I was very privileged to spend a year on a civilian leadership course called Future Vision, which was where there was like 25 in the cohort who are all C-suite leaders across the public and private sector. Wow, that was just brilliant, because you think you know it all, and then you go and meet somebody that's running a hospital or somebody that's running a local council, and then again you're learning by doing and learning different ways of tackling the problem. So there's a few more, but I'll just very quickly, and then I'm conscious because of conversation, not so much a Q&A, but I think I talked about the Sandhurst gig I'm doing at the moment, mentoring, coaching, really, really important. And being humble enough to reach out and ask for some help. And I do remember occasion when I was commanding a brigade and some soldiers had been killed on the ranges and being under a great deal of pressure by the chain of command, to sort out, and it had been a systemic failure. There had been a systemic failure in one of that led to people getting killed. And it was the classic say-do gap, those coming back from Afghan and Iraq who knew how to do all this stuff, and then a new generation coming in who didn't. There's an assumption that was wrong. The context had changed. And I remember getting coaching. I went and found a coach. The Army helped me get one. And that was a godsend. I thought that was really, 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 really significant. And then I'd add to that counselling. We can come back to that. But I've done, I've always done a little bit, when I've had difficult times, I've done therapy. I still do it now. It's probably the best £125 a month I spend, just absolutely on personal development, knowing that I've got to learn. And that leads me really to I think the fifth major point actually is, I call it the three legs of the stool: yourself, your family, and your work. And you'll be the same as me. When those aren't aligned, you can't sit on the stool. And in my case, so that was a marriage that cost me a marriage some years ago. You know what I mean? And I regret that I didn't get the legs of the stool right. Yeah.
No, that's really interesting. Actually, you make a number of points that I'll come back on, because I think the interesting. I might steal your analogy of the three-legged stool, because that I talk all the time about balance being between personal and professional. But in the same breath, personal is kind of you plus also the family bit and making the right kind of commitment, and the fact that one can help the other one if you're in trouble. Your personal life can pull your professional life back into the right place, or vice versa. But if they both go wrong, it's not so great. But actually, you're right. If you take one of the legs away from the stool, then obviously the stool doesn't work, falls over. I mean, I think the coaching and mentoring, interestingly, I mean, I would say this: you'll be the same. Doing coaching these days, I think the it is really valuable. I think it's often not realized how valuable it is by an awful lot of people. And I think the military, certainly in my days, was not great about this. I remember actually quite late on in my very last job, I was going down because I was responsible for some of this stuff. I was down at Shrivenham talking to the sort of Defence Leadership Centre, and the being talked through the kind of hierarchy of events and courses, if you like, that most of which I'd done. But at the top of this, they were talking about coaching for 2 stars and above. I'm going, well, who gets that? And so, well, because it was effectively a well kept secret that they didn't overly advertise to people, but you could access it, and I subsequently did, and it was immensely valuable. But I do think it's been one of those things that we've dragged out quite painfully. On the other hand, as you said, one of the things from the military, and I'm often saying to people, the commonest misconception I see in leadership training these days is people have the view that the military is very authoritarian and that's it. It's bark at people and they jump, which couldn't be further from the truth than any of the services. I'm sure you'd agree. And I think you do get all these different training events that are fantastic in their own right. I mean, it doesn't mean every military leader is brilliant, but it does mean you've had lots of opportunity to both to be trained and also to lead people, which is just not the case often in the commercial space. And that's a real advantage that we definitely get. Looping back though to what you said right at the beginning, where when you were at Sandhurst, and joining the regiment initially, that most of the senior NCOs and things had been in the Falklands, and then talk about that say-do gap stuff with the people being killed on the ranges. How big an issue did you think that was for, and is maybe in that kind of world, and it translates probably directly into the civilian world as well, when you've got people who've been through some big thing like the Falklands War, for example, and now you come in as the bright, shiny new leader on the top of this team and making your mark as a leader. How big a challenge was that? Were they really good in supporting you and recognizing that actually they needed to develop you, and you opening yourself up to that and enabling yourself to be developed in that way, or was it hard?
I think it was both, and it's a lot of it down to personalities, of course, isn't it? And setting the safe space to have those really good conversations. I think it just comes down to learning again, doesn't it? It's all about and if you can learn as an organization, you're great. But we didn't have a great culture of being safe to fail, because of the way the appraisal system works, and people were terrified of making mistakes, and some of these mistakes would happen because systemically people were different. There were different levels of training and experience, and I do think that what I love about the British Army in particular, and probably all three services, because my father was Navy, is our officer senior NCO culture is so strong that I went nowhere without a good platoon sergeant, a good sergeant major, a good command sergeant major to keep me in my place, to keep my feet on the ground, even though I was hard charging, always innovative, always forward looking. They would be dragging me back, and it would be really painful at times. But actually, that was culturally, that's a really good model to make sure that you've got the right, the right balance, as you described, the right balance, so you can get the good result. So there's always going to be tension. I think that tension is really healthy. It's when they become too far apart, and then you get a bit of a breakdown, which is which is I saw happen on a number of occasions. Somebody's ego is more important than their.
I totally agree. Totally agree. I mean, I think particularly the empowering, and this is definitely translatable to every walk of life, empowering the people in your team to be able to turn around and challenge you, and if not publicly, then certainly privately, to take you on one side and go, do you really think that's a good idea? Can we just talk about this first? And have those kind of really honest conversations and a bit of debate, and ultimately then the other way around, for them to recognize that somebody's in charge, and whoever's in charge is going to make the decision, and then you're going to carry it on. Because I do think one of the pitfalls, if you like, of the modern world in the sort of that we've created for ourselves certainly in the UK, is a bit of a sense that it's too democratic and it's too much waiting for a kind of consensus agreement, and that isn't always going to happen. And at the end of the day, people want leaders to be decisive. They don't want people who have sort of flannel around and don't actually make decisions. It's just not helpful at all. You need people who ultimately are going to listen to all the debates and then if necessary, and you can't actually reach a kind of obvious consensus, everyone's agreed, everyone's going in the same direction, then make a decision and lead it, and then push the people to along the journey and inspire them to follow you along it as well. Because I do think we've lost that a little bit sometimes.
It's really interesting. So I can think of two really good examples. I had the privilege of working in US Central Command for General Austin, and I'd only been there literally a couple of days, and was the Mount Sinjar in northern Iraq was 40,000 Yazidi were on this mountain, and I was the one star. I was the one star at the time, and I was tasked to get them off. It was simple as that. It was just literally make it happen. I don't think I could even figure out how to turn the computer on. And I walked into this plans room with 100 odd American, US Marine, US Air Force, US Navy, some Brits, some Australians, Five Eyes type stuff, and thinking, what on earth? How am I going to? Anyway, we worked all night, and we just, like Trojans, just started just making stuff happen to get these people off. It's everything from people like you dropping bombs on ISIS through to the flying the F-22s from Afghan to getting CH-47s into place, getting A dropped. It was all sorts of stuff happening all very, very quickly. And the next morning, I was on a VTC with General Austin and the key staff with President Obama, and it's quite a privilege. And I was a brigadier, so I was kind of master of ceremonies, just making sure that everything was happening. Made the odd comment, and at the end of it, at the end of the VTC, President Obama said to General Austin, what's the Brit doing in the room? And this is really interesting. General Austin said they speak truth to power. And I think that's really interesting in the context of what's happening. And that's the light came on that's what we were there to do, to be the junior partner, but be asked the difficult questions. And we were never afraid to, whereas a lot of my American counterparts would never ask, what I mean? Because they were just too terrified of you're right, the opposite to this democracy, and I do remember flying to Qatar to CENTCOM forward, and for a war game. It was counter dash war game, and he had the component commanders in, and it was in the bunker there, and he said, right, we're gonna have a really good discussion. I want to have a proper fight about how we're going to do this part of this part of the campaign. And he said, well, this is the way it works. I slap the table at the end of this meeting, we move out on this plan. You know what I mean? Really decisive. And I was acting as the red team for this particular event, and it was all about the Russians getting involved. No, then and people were just, no, it's never going to happen. They're not going to. We were like pushing it really hard. 3 days later, it happened. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
And if he hadn't slapped the table and said, we're moving out on this because we've got to be ready, and we trained a force that then got completely done over. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, totally. So fascinating. I think that your point about Barack Obama and the meeting. I mean, I didn't actually meet him, but I had similar experiences when I was in the Pentagon as the Chief of Defense Staff's liaison officer, where that was the whole Libya campaign going on in 2011 when I was there. And for me, that was the absolute crystallization of what people talk about and mean with the special relationship, because it was quite clear that, I mean, I was the only, well, along with my deputy, we were the only two foreign officers that had a 24-hour access to the Pentagon. All of there are lots of other foreign officers who had Pentagon passes, but none of them were 24-hour. And during quite a lot of that in the joint staff area where I was sitting in meetings that, frankly, I had no right to be there, and it was some of which were quite extraordinary. I mean, with the chairman and things like that, where they obviously valued the relationship. It was very much around trust and sharing of stuff to make sure in both directions that we absolutely recognize that, even though it might say a classification at the top of it which said they shouldn't have shared it with me, or vice versa, that it was really important in that moment to actually say, look, you probably want to see this because it's probably relevant to what you're going to do. And I think that's one of the really valuable things about that kind of relationship, that you have that kind of bond. And I remember Vice Admiral Gortney, who was the director of the Joint Staff at the time, Bill Gortney, in a conversation with somebody else on a visit where I was there, and they were talking about this, and he said the Brits are the one nation that work with us that actually will genuinely close with the enemy. And and it's obviously, I mean, as we speak, and we're recording this, in a time where stuff is a bit more variable now in terms of the way that's looking with the relationship with the US, with Donald Trump in the White House and so on. And I think it must be really interesting right now to be in the US military and some of the stuff that's happening, and see where the pressure's coming from. I was listening, you may have listened to it, there's the General and the Journalist podcast
Yeah,
that
Patrick Saunders. Yeah.
yeah, so Patrick used to work for me back in the day when he was a 1 star in the directorate when I was ACDS Ops, and he then took over for me in that job actually. And one of their recent episodes was talking about this stuff going on in the US, and the test it must be putting on the US military, and particularly at senior level, whereas they want to be apolitical, they want to be able to work for whichever commander in chief, etc., and they're being slightly hand forced into you're part of the MAGA support team, and that's got to be tough. It's got to be quite a challenging environment. It's going to be really interesting, I think, to see how that plays through in the long term. Because knowing them well as do you, that I can't imagine that's an easy debate for an awful lot of them probably doesn't sit comfortably with what they're doing. And my view of always in my service was always, look, you've got two choices: take it, follow the government of the day's bidding, or leave. There's no middle ground in that. If you don't like it, then ultimately your only route out is to turn around and go, no, I'm fine. Well, that's beyond my value set. Sorry, I'm going to go. And I suspect some of them are probably being sorely tested in that space at the minute.
Yeah, and I think we're quite lucky. Our system's we're quite blessed, particularly from the royal perspective, because I think that gives us an air gap. That's enabled definitely in our past to maintain that impartiality and maintain that apolitical stance with it set by the royal family. You know what I mean? That sets us above commissioned officers, and a bit old fashioned, I know, but I was privileged to to have got a lot to do with them in different times, and I just think that's such a key part of our approach to things, and then being able to account for that. So I remember going to Iraq twice. I went to Iraq, commanded troops in Iraq. My regiment's from the north of England, northwest of England, very left wing, very anti-Iraq war. I mean, the context, they didn't agree with Blair's decision making to do that. So you were going to war with the full understanding that the people might not be behind this, but we were all trained, prepared. It just meant you dialed it in a different way in your head. You communicated in a different way to get the context, bringing them all home, or as many of them home alive as possible. Going on operations and doing what you must do, not what I feel like doing. You know what I mean? Just to get my medals or to get my ego stroked. It was all about being really thoughtful and sensible and just doing exactly what was required, but delivering it. And I think I've been very fortunate with that. And you're right. And if I think of my American colleagues, and I know some of them that have lost their jobs, quite senior, very senior people that have lost their jobs not so recently because of certain leadership styles, and it's a tragedy.
Yeah, very difficult. I mean, Mark Milley, obviously, was the chairman who was appointed under Donald Trump in his first term. I mean, Mark was in the Pentagon as one of the guys I used to work with all the time when I was CDSLO.
Yeah.
And and he, of course, has been one of the most vocal for sure, and obviously then has clearly is part of the kind of revenge being wreaked from Donald Trump's side in terms of what's happening, and I think that's got to be very, very tough. I mean, when not least if you spend your whole career, pretty much your whole working life, if you're reaching that level in that kind of role, you don't want it to end that way. I mean, I just feel for them. I think that's very difficult. Very, very difficult.
So a very good, amusing story with General Mark. So he was coming to Scotland. So I was commanding the brigade in Scotland, and he was coming to the tattoo, and we were looking after him. And he went to visit one of my units, the Scots Dragoon Guards. And you'll hear me talk when I talk about leadership. I always bang about context. And any briefing, I always start with a context slide, which is this Harvard Business School Cynefin model, which is simple, the complicated, the complex, and the chaotic. So I painted this slide, which has got loads of images on it, and we had an image of Donald Trump, and I put it is initially in the chaos, and then because just stuff happens. What's happening next? And my chief of staff, we were minutes before the meeting. It was a working lunch with General Milley, and my chief of staff said, "So I think we should move it into the complicated, or because it might be, you know." And so I said, "Okay, let's do that. Let's just keep, you know." And then Milley sits down there in front of the screen and gives it. What's he doing there? Put him well to the left.
Yeah, I can well imagine that.
So I
Priceless.
should have just but there you go, you know,
Yeah.
protecting.
Oh,
But I do think that kind of because what you know, there's a great leader. I never worked for him properly, directly, but another guy that had courage,
yeah,
sharing
definitely,
out,
definitely. So,
moral
and I mean,
integrity. You know,
yeah, and I think, and that's a really big thing. If you're a senior leader, I think holding your own value set, sticking to your guns. Again, doesn't matter whether you're military or something else. You've got to have values, and you mustn't compromise on them ultimately. And if you're, that's where you're really tested, and where you've got to have your the moral courage to stand up and be candid in the right
yeah,
circumstances. I was
yeah,
quite
100%.
struck by what you said about working with Lloyd Austin actually on the 1 day off in 18 months thing. I mean, interestingly, that is one of the things I would absolutely not advocate. I do think when I went to Kandahar, I was and this is no slight at all on my predecessor Ashley Stevenson, because he'd done a brilliant job in very difficult circumstances as the first NATO commander of Kandahar airfield, previously been American, and he had a huge amount of work to transition it into that kind of NATO space. And so they had been working incredibly hard for the time he'd been there. But when I arrived, there was no longer that need to have that kind of manic approach to the way we were doing it. So I said, look, stop. We don't need to work 7 days a week, 16 hours a day, every individual on the base. We need to turn around and have a lamp that we can turn back up when the temperature requires it. So, from now on, everyone has a day off, including me. I don't care which day of the week it is, etc. So we can actually give you back some
Yeah,
space to then be able to ratchet it back up again if we need to. Because I think that's one of the things that people often, they'll turn the tempo up, and you get to this point where there is no further up. And if you're not careful, you just burn yourself out. And I've seen a few, actually particularly very, very talented American officers who, were, and not least because they did such long tours in operational theatres, who I think that was really stressing them, because they do have a kind of slightly different approach to that. And I'm not sure that's necessarily healthy. And I don't think it's healthy in any environment. I think, you see it in the civilian space as well, where you've got some individuals who are very, very work focused, don't necessarily think about the impact and the kind of mini me creation and the kind of messaging they're sending down to their teams, because people want to look like them, right? They want to be successful. They want to breed that they're going to breed that same behavior if they're not careful in the people that work for them. And I've seen one or two people again in the services where their staff were absolutely run ragged because this individual being, we had one particular Air Force officer who had a habit of being very early in the morning, he'd be in, and he'd be in very late at night. And of course, his staff would always be in before him and leave after him. And he didn't ask them to do that. In fact, I think he actively discouraged them from doing it. But the reality was they were always going to do that. And I think it's, again, from a leadership behavior point of view, you need to think about how are you managing this yourself to turn around and make sure you're not putting that kind of conditionality on the people that work around you.
couldn't agree with you more, Bob. And I see it on the general staff development pathway work I do in the British Army right now. These are really talented. They're the top, 2%, 3% of their cohort. They're all in really crunchy jobs. They've got 25 years of experience. They're all A grade, top people. But quite a lot of them are full up. They're full. And it's not simply full because of the work, because the resources are tight. They're full because their own personal lives are busy. With children of that age where you've got to, and they've got to commute long distances, and their wives work, and their wives do punchy jobs, as well. So that's a lot on an individual, and just building in that time to reflect, recharge, slow down, check yourself out in the mirror, the old shave test. How am I today is really, really, really important. I dealt with one of the characters recently who because they now have a 180 degree appraisal, when they come into this program, and they've got to have invited 20 people that have worked for them before, boys, girls, civil servants, and serving, to and they get asked questions like, would you serve with this person again? And you'll get a score. 80% would say yes, and 20% would say no. And then you interrogate that a little bit more. And okay, yeah, we don't live in a perfect world, and you don't want 100%, because if you've disciplined somebody or censured someone, then of course they're not going to want to work for you again, are they? But I dug into one of these in a little bit more detail, and he wasn't. Quite a number didn't want to work for him again. And when you looked at it really carefully, what it was simply was he would send emails out on Sunday evenings to people ready for the week, not realizing that everybody's connected all the time. And when you get an email from the boss, you get electrocuted. And I can't remember what book it was years ago I read, but there was these experiments they did on mice where they took these two mice and they electrocuted one regularly at a regular time throughout a period, through a period, and they electrocuted another one irregularly, and then at the end of the experiment, they killed both mice. So the experiment wasn't that successful, but when they opened the mice up, the mice that had been electrocuted regularly was as healthy. It was really super healthy. And the mouse that had been electrocuted irregularly was cancerous and very sick. There's something in that, isn't there?
Wow, really? Yeah.
So if you're electrocuting people on a Sunday evening, that's not leadership.
Yeah. Oh no, I totally agree with that. I find it interesting to that exact point. Again, I talk all the time about that, where I say if you're in the habit of doing that, get out of the habit of doing it. And the ones that make me really laugh are when you send an email out and on the bottom of your signature block it said, "I work unusual hours. Please don't feel the need to respond in the and you kind of go, that just doesn't work. At the end of the day, if you're a leader in the organization, people are going to want to be responsive. They're going to want to try and impress you by being on it, and they see that as the road to success and the behavior they need to exhibit. And it's just it's totally unnecessary. I mean, particularly in today's world with applications that you can just turn around and set timers on and all the rest of it. So you just send the email to be sent the next day. I totally agree. I think it's poor behavior that and again, particularly it matters less if it's just someone in the team. And I do it some of the time, and I'm sending emails to people all the time because I'm working weird hours doing what I do. But I'm not leading a team anymore. I think if you're in the leadership of the team, you need to think a bit harder about what kind of message you're sending, doing all that sort of stuff. Switch tack just a little bit, but it was a decent segue because leadership traits, behaviors and things. What do you think is the kind of, if you were writing a short list of things, what are the things that are really important for you, either for yourself
I think
or others?
Integrity comes up pretty close to the top. Trust, building trust, absolutely 100%. I've always been one of those people that, because of the nature of the teams I've been in, and this is probably a change from being in the military to being a civilian. Actually, I think I learned in the military I trusted everybody 100% straight away, and then you tend to get a bit. Then you drop off if they hadn't performed. You know what I mean? So you immediately start with that right. You are perfect because you're part of this brotherhood, this part of Band of Brothers or whatever, and then slowly they could be erased either because of behaviors or performance. So I think that's really important. But I think I might reverse that because I think I've fallen over a couple of times as a civilian where I've made that assumption 100%. You're really on your game. Actually, they weren't. You know what I mean? Because it's a bit of bluff, it hasn't got the same depth. And so I'm probably, one of the big lessons I've learned since doing what I now do, having since left, is I'm less naturally as trusting, but I still think trust is important in leadership. But I'm much more cautious than I was. That's about learning the context.
Yeah, I tend to say to people as well, trust is a very interesting one, and I totally agree it's a really important one. And I always say to people, look, it's about trusting, but it's also about being trusted. Both things are really important, and you need to create the conditions where people trust you and believe in you, but you also need to be, trusting the team. And I had an interesting conversation with a group relatively recently where I said to them, okay, so are you the sort of people, show of hands here, do you trust by default? You're, right, I'm going into I've never met you before, but I'm assuming you're trustworthy right away, or are you much more skeptical about it? And it was quite interesting because there was a big division where, probably almost 50-50 actually, where people were, somewhere and are much more skeptical. And I definitely share your view. I'm probably more into trust by default, until you let me down, I'm going to trust you. But I'm never quite in the 100% space, that's for sure. Initially, and those first few important days, weeks, months, when you're working with someone quite closely, will shape that very, very directly in terms of where are we going with this? Am I actually going to trust you more, or am I going to trust you less? And if I start trusting you less, of course, it's increasingly hard to get it back. That's the old cliche, isn't it? It's hard won, easily lost, and I think that is
Yeah.
really true.
And I think the thing that falls out from that then is this business of being authentic, just being authentic. Authentic leaders count. Just being honest about your weaknesses as well as your strengths. I think the best teams is when you sat down and gone, I'm not very good at this. I've never done this before. We've got to do this together. Being really, and don't try and bluff it.
No, I totally agree. I mean, I
Crash,
remember. I remember when I went to Coningsby actually as a station commander, and I was taking over the Typhoon, the introduction to service of the Typhoon, and being the Typhoon Force commander. And of course, I was a ground attack pilot. I'd not been an air defense pilot. So, and obviously the station had all the other things that go with being a station, so all the supply side, the admin side, the engineering side, and everything else, none of which I was an expert in. And that bit was obvious. But even on the flying side, I definitely remember, sitting down with a bunch of people saying, look, you guys are going to have to help me work through this to turn around and be, what I need to be in terms of the right kind of leader for the organization, because you have years of experience doing this role. I have zero. So at the end of the day, we've got to work together to make that work. And actually, some people I think are nervous about being kind of quite that open about that and showing enough, ankle, as it were, that you're going to be, you're making yourself a bit vulnerable. Whereas actually, I think it was hugely helpful. I think it really worked for me in terms of people then going, yeah, okay, right, this is how we can, we can work with you to get you to where you need to be. If you go in the other way with the I am the great I am, and then they're just waiting for you to fall flat on your face because they know you're going to at some point, because they're they're not going to be so forward leaning in helping you.
That plays to this whole learning not learned piece, and I see this in the military. You get to a point where, and in the army, it's probably battalion command where you know everything. You can everybody, everything, all the procedures, you've done them all in your time. And then you step out about, you go above that. You're privileged enough to go above that. Well, you don't know everything anymore because there's stuff that's going to happen. You just cannot. So you've got to be learning. And I remember I referred to people dying on the ranges and having a coach, and the coach that I got was a guy off the oil rigs who did risk, working with the oil companies on risk. And it was absolutely brilliant learning, because he talked to me about, well, let's talk about, bits of cheese with holes in it, all these different systems, all these safety systems. And every so often they're going to line up and catastrophe is going to happen. So how do you can't know what happened, but you can know, you can go and meet the person who's running that system and get them to teach you and learn about it. And then that way you might have some awareness about where the risk's actually going to come from, And if you can encourage that as a culture, then that's really, really, really good. And I see it as I see it in the business world, in the commercial world. I've been working with people who have done really, really well, have been incredibly successful in one industry, in one part of the world, and then they've adapted it to something else, but they've still got the old toolkit. It's because of their ego, because of their wealth. They've taken the hammer with the screw when you need the multi-role screwdriver.
Yeah, I think the other thing that the mistake I've seen people make plenty of times as well is because they are good at something, and that's what's got them promoted, that's got them, got them the job they've now got in the organization, etc. They've been very successful at that. So that's a skill set they know they can fall back on and rely on. So that instead of actually just saying, okay, fine, I know how to do that, and diversifying and looking out more broadly at all the other stuff that's going on and learning a bit more, they might do that, but at the same time, they drill too deeply and too micromanaging down into the thing that they used to do. If I look at me as a pilot, for example, in my latter days, going back when I was lucky enough to go back to my old squadron, for example, and go flying with them when I was way beyond that. I was now running the ops directorate in the MOD, whatever it was, 10 plus years on, or nearly 10 years on, and it was completely fascinating to see how far they had come and how far behind I was now in terms of if I'd been jumping in that to try and do that myself, because I've moved on and I'm doing different stuff, and so the skills that I'd had, which were still relevant and still, I still knew what I was doing basically, but not to the same extent at all. And I do think it's a mistake quite often people make, that they don't allow themselves the space to recognize you've moved beyond that to the description you just had, really, that that's no longer your primary thing. So don't try and be great at that anymore. Just accept that that was, you've got credibility because you did it before, and that's what you need to develop and move on to where you're going next. But you'll get more credibility by being more inclusive, looking more broadly at the team you've got, and leveraging their experience rather than necessarily trying to do stuff yourself that you're no longer the best at.
Yeah, I think you just answered my next key point. Actually, was this whole thing about team. Getting the right team around you is key, and they're not all the same. You don't want echo chambers. It was a great, many years ago, I think a commanding officer threw Edward de Bono's Six Thinking Hats at me and told me to read it to start thinking laterally. I was only a young officer, but the whole thing of, having different, diverse thought really helps decision making, really, really, really important.
Oh yeah, I think the echo chamber point's really powerful. Just the worst thing you want, isn't it? You just don't want that sort of reinforcing groupthink mentality. You definitely need people who are going to come in, not only going to come in and can come in with more disruptive thinking, but actually encouraging them to do that. And the old 2 ears, 1 mouth, listen first, talk later, is just so important, because if you're not careful, you won't ever get that diverse input, because they'll just think, no, you don't want to hear that. You're fixed on this is the way you're going to go. Tell us a bit about what you've been doing since you left the military, and where life's taken you, how that journey's evolved.
Yeah, sure. So I kind of so what I did was quite funny. Actually, when I first left, I had 5 months, 4 or 5 months, still being paid as a major general, because I'd been in Italy. That's my last, and COVID had happened, so I had lots of leave and time available because we just hadn't had any. And COVID was like being on ops down there. I can tell you, Brexit and COVID in southern Italy was quite the operation. I can tell you. And thanks to the Air Force actually for helping us out so many times, because with no post office, because that's the only time the BFPO ever failed because of Brexit and then COVID, somebody would have a compassionate, a sick parent or a sick child, and the only way of getting them there was thanks to the Royal Air Force coming to get them, which was great.
Good that we were of service.
It was superb, yeah, and it was really. I must have cost a lot of money, but it was brilliant, and so the boys and girls were really, really grateful. So when I left, I went to. I really want to go and save the planet. You need purpose. And I was really inspired by the climate change emergency. I think Mark Carney's book Values. I don't know if anybody's read that, but that's worth a read. And COP26 was happening in Scotland, and so I spent a couple of months just literally working for free. I think I was the highest paid apprentice, and I worked for Wood Group. I worked for Scottish Electric. I did some stuff on windmills. I did it. It's just great fun, And what then happened is I got picked up by a chair of a company to go and be chief of transformation of a hydrogen company, which was again, and I called it going to an Afghan fob, but in East Lothian without the rockets. And this was, a small SME, 50 people, a load of Gen Zers who did computer aided design. A load of people that built stuff who are mostly ex-Navy or off the rigs, and then a leadership team and a chief executive who was so toxic. He was brilliant. I called him the Steve Jobs of hydrogen, but oh my God, he was a freaking nightmare. The retention that he was just, and so I understand now why the chair of the board got hold of me and he said, I need you to go and transform this place and basically lead from behind, which is basically what I did. I did that for a year, which was really, really good experience, but hard, because, you're outside your comfort zone. You're not in the military. I didn't have an outer office to organize my life. The pay was pretty rubbish to start with. And I was living away from home. But actually after a couple of months, I got into it and it really was brilliant. But what it was best for was it gave me lots of commercial expertise. I understood cash. And better than any course I'd done, all paled in significance to actually being with the finance director sweating because he's wondering how he's going to pay everybody,
Mm.
you know? So that was great. I then got headhunted from that into be the UK MD for GardaWorld, and it's a whole leaders club broadcast. Again, shiny lights, 100% trust in people. Didn't get the context. The context was this company had, taken out a lot of big contracts from G4S, Control Risk, Pilgrims, by going in really low at a really low margin, 3 or 4%. And these were big 100 million pound dollar contracts across the world. And of course, the maths wasn't adding up. If you came out of COVID, inflation came through the roof, and they're effectively a mergers and acquisitions company, not a security company. It's all about making the big people money. Absolutely all about making money. I used to call the chief exec Dr. No, like stroking his cat. And it was really interesting because, again, I got the context wrong. I was leading this organization, but I was touring the different sites and facilities. I was only in the early days of it. And I went to visit one of them in Libya, went to visit this call sign that was doing a EU mission. And they were special forces, ex-special forces people looking after the EU. Because of Brexit, we put a French company to front it. And the Libyans had decided they were going to put an extra tax on us to want more money. Basically, this was graft. They wanted us to pay more. We couldn't do that because that would have been illegal. We weren't negotiating smart enough. In the end, they decided to press our buttons, and they took 7 of them into captivity, where they were then kept for 45 days. And that was probably, since leaving the military, the toughest leadership test I had, because
I can imagine
7 men and women in captivity in a lawless country, being held by a militia, and you're on your own because it's commercial. There's no government coming to help, you know what I mean? And that was a real dig. And the organization was in pieces. I mean, there was people running around like lunatics. There was no crisis management framework. There was nothing. So, it was proper good old fashioned, right? Let's get a grip of this. Let's get purpose. Let's get rhythm. Let's get process in place. Let's illuminate the networks to try and get these people out. And we did get them out 45 days later. And I went and met them. We didn't pay, didn't bribe anybody. It was good old fashioned negotiation to, alleviate. But as a result of that, and this is the naivety, we were outlawed from the country. We had to exfiltrate everything. We lost all our licenses, and we lost 6 million quid off the bottom line in about a week. And the powers that be in Montreal decided, oh, I don't need them lot anymore in London, because we need to make a saving because of all the money that's lost. So they, I got made redundant, which was a massive blow to morale, because that's not what you expect to happen. You know what I mean?
Not on the back of that. No, I mean that's really poor, isn't it?
Yeah,
was that true for the ones that are in captivity as well?
Yeah. They all paid off, and it's funny. Netflix want to make a movie about it, and but we're all everybody's got NDAs, and nobody can touch it. And when lawyers come sniffing, as they do, and others come sniffing every so often, I can't even talk about it because it's just completely tied up. But that was probably a big low since leaving, and of course, as a UKMD, I felt that was a leadership failure. I just wasn't on it enough. The context, I just wasn't, and I wasn't empowered enough. Empowerment to make a quick difference, because this, it's all wrapped up in contracts and money and people, and so that was a bit of a bit of a low. I describe it as.
So, I mean, just to dive into a little bit more within the bounds of what you can say, I mean, what was the aftermath for the people? I mean, were they, how did they bounce back from that?
Yeah, traumatized. I did quite a lot of work on this, actually, because we were all. The one thing the company did do is they gave us trauma counselling, and it was really interesting because I wasn't traumatized as they were, but a number of people were, and they're obviously, they did this so that they can mitigate any risks of litigation down the line, But it was really good. I've done another podcast with Safe Haven. They're an organisation up in Manchester who do trauma therapy, and it's particularly about that experience of, and it was really interesting because I did it as a leader, and it was 4 sessions where you went through you relived the whole case, you went through everything that happened, you try to learn the lessons about yourself and organisation, which was really, really good. Fundamentally, I did it to inspire others to go and get the treatment. Some of whom did, some of whom didn't. When we first flew them out to Tunis, we took a team in of psychologists and we did a proper decompression, like you'll remember from Afghan, or Iraq, we go. So we did a bloodhound camp type thing where right, let's get them all in one place, let's get them cleaned up, get them, make sure they didn't have any, their bloods were all good and all this sort of kit, and then lots of counselling and therapy to put them through. The guys I think mostly are okay. But there was a young lady, she was Irish. No, she's pretty bad way. Even now, I mean, I think it broke her. I've not heard from her for a couple of months, but I check in every so often just to see. But it's quite traumatic, and then because this isn't, and there's nothing in place. This is the risk of this business. People are attracted to the bright lights of this, private security world, thinking it's like being in the army. Well, it's not, because you don't have any backup. I got invited back to Libya some weeks later before I got made redundant because the powers that be realized there was now a gap because a lot of the other security companies were scared because of what happened to us, and they wanted to renegotiate the position. And I agreed to go back in, and I went in with with another guy who's a former special forces warrant officer. We went in with burner phones, a Revolut card, thinking, it's just terrifying. It's just absolutely terrifying. And we got to meet a minister, we got to have a conversation, but all the way to getting on the airplane to get out of there, it was just any minute something horrible was gonna happen, and it just isn't worth it. I did it because there were people still on the ground there, who were running in the British embassy and the American embassy in particular, who were GardaWorld, because they weren't affected by this meltdown. So it was all about making it better for them, but not much fun.
No, I can well imagine. I really feel for you. It's horrendous, and especially to then be, kind of be made redundant on the back end of it. And when you look at that kind of the obvious potential prospects of a job like that, I mean, it sounds tremendously attractive, and it is interesting, isn't it? How often you see this stuff on the news far too regularly as well, where people. I mean, I think often they're accused of being very foolish, and sometimes probably that's a fair criticism. Whether they've gone effectively on a tourism trip or whatever into places where you should have known better. Look at the Foreign and Commonwealth advice, etc. But it's there are so many places that unless you've been to some of these places, as we unfortunately have, that you wouldn't then go on holiday. Well, just don't think that it's going to be okay just because you kind of look at what your research and your view of what you've seen in the media and all the rest of it, because some of them are really very, very tricky. And when it goes wrong, as you say, back up. What back up? And of course, if you've ultimately gone against the advice that you were given in the first place, or you're in a position where it's a private company and the government's going to go wash their hands of it, then very, very tough. That's really challenging. So how's life picked back up for you after that, though? How did you get yourself out of that low point?
So I set my own consultancy up, with a view to see what else would come along. And that's almost 2 years ago now, 2.5 years ago, and it's actually going really well. A variation. I all around leadership, I guess. There's a bit of business development. I mentioned at the beginning, I'm doing some work for the Canadians at the moment. There's a theme to it, which is all about helping others, to get to success in some way, shape, or form. Whether it's the business, whether it's helping out at Santos, with this program I'm doing. I've been doing some work for a quite a high-end PR company in London called Molten PR, who are really inspiring bunch of people who do sort of litigation, reputation management, crisis management. So there's lots of opportunity, and right now it's going okay. But as you know, when you're working for yourself, it's feast or famine, isn't it? So you're either full on, like I'm full on delivery right now, and I'm about to head off to London to chair a defence conference for the next 2 days for a company called IQPC, an International Dismounted Soldier, it's called, and I'll be in my element for 2 days because it's just like being back in NATO. Chairing even Cos Shapes turning up tomorrow, and I've got Commandant Land Warfare Centre, Director, Commandant Santos, all the procurers, the operators. There are probably 15 nations are going to be represented. That'll be great for 2 days, and good networking and good fun. And then I'll be back to the hard reality of, right, what's next? Because when you're delivering, you can't can't find it.
Yeah, and you're totally right about the feast famine thing. I mean, it possibly takes us a little bit into the transition discussion slightly because I think, I mean, as I was leaving, and particularly leaving as a senior guy, as you were as well, I remember vividly, the way I described it to lots of people is I met loads and loads of people and asked them for kind of advice, views, and everything else. And I had quite a few people who said, "Oh, you should do this portfolio thing, and I don't get fixed into one particular job." And actually, I'm very glad with hindsight that I didn't do that. I jumped into Deloitte and then did a chunk of time with Deloitte and then stepped out. And now I kind of do that. But I think that feast famine thing is really important. And the other point you made a little bit earlier on is understanding money. Because I think coming out of the military in particular, where you might well have managed some very big budgets, into many many millions of pounds, but at the same time they're budgets, they're not P&Ls. You're not sitting there trying to make money for the organization.
Yeah.
I think there is a real temptation to be seduced into this. This is going to be quite an easy space to operate in, and the reality is it's complicated. And it can, people make a great success of it some of the time, but there can equally be times when it really changes dramatically on you. But what was your kind of experience? What advice would you offer, probably in terms of that transition journey? You've been much more recent in it than me. I'm 10 years out now.
So I think there's a good infantry adage: always have one foot on the ground. So fire maneuver. Sort of put down a fire base, hold the ground, then maneuver to the next place. And so. In my case, very lucky, we bought a small house, so we didn't overextend mortgages, in a place, in the middle of the country, so between Oxford and Swindon, near Shrivenham. My wife works at the Defence Academy. She worked there for many years. She's a retired Canadian officer. So she's now on the senior management team there. Pay's not great, but she loves it, and this gives her an opportunity. That her working with my pension, sensibly marriage is the foot on the ground, and then that enables me to go wherever I need to go to do the work and have fun, try and enjoy doing it is the key. So that would be my top, the top thing. Don't overstretch. I've got so many people I can see who have been in one lifestyle. I lived in a command house in Edinburgh that had 7 bedrooms and staff, and what I mean, and then don't go and buy the multi-million-pound home that you can't afford, because you've only got so left. Just keep it really sensible. Think of it as a P&L. Think of it as what's your bottom line looking like, and can you sustain it? And I think there's a really, really important piece I've learned, and I've been teaching this or sharing this with other leaders, is what's wealth. What's wealth, And I listened to Ranjan Chatterjee, the Feel Better, Live More podcast. A brilliant one recently, all about wealth, where it was he named the 5 types of wealth. So the first one was your financial, which we always think as wealth. Second one was your body, your fitness, your what activity you do. The third one was social and societal. How many friends do you have? Who do you connect with? The third one was time. The fourth one was time. Never thought of that before, because we're always running out of time, aren't we? And the fifth one was your mental health. So my wife and I went out for lunch the other week, and we did a wealth audit, and we scored ourselves out of each one. We said if we're poor, pauper, middle income, rich, or stinking rich.
Yeah, and how did it go?
We did okay. We weren't brilliant. I mean, we were rich in some places, but we were poor in others. I say what we were. I say where we were poor. Socially, we're poor because we missed the military, because we went everywhere with our friends, and it's really hard to. And my wife works like a trader; she enjoys it, but she doesn't have any friends anymore because they're all over the world. You know what I mean? And I've just been to a stag weekend in Jersey, and I deliberately made an effort to go because I just wanted to reconnect. Is that somebody's getting married again, and I go out of my way and to do so. So I think that's really important to understand what wealth is. You only need what's enough. You don't need to be stinking rich.
No, I think that's right. And I think, interestingly, enjoying what you do for me is absolutely paramount in whatever it is you're doing, whether that's leisure or work stuff. And if you're not doing it, I often say to people that in training courses as well, so don't get to my age and wish you'd done something else with your life. You need to definitely be focused on if the moving average is not upwards in terms of enjoyment, and or at least constant. You're going to have some bad days, and you're going to have some maybe bad periods. But if the average is not in the right place, you need to think about what you're doing with yourself, because otherwise, it's just chasing the money and having a really miserable life. No, okay, fine. If you're chasing the money for a limited period of time for doing something, and then but you've got a clear plan to exit from that, and maybe that's a valid strategy.
Yeah.
But I mean, I do think it's interesting as well. I feel it myself all the time, and my wife points it out to me all the time as well, that you never seem to have any time. You're rushing, doing stuff. And I actually think societally we've kind of got ourselves in that place a little bit, where 20 years ago I don't think I felt like that. I because you didn't have all the connectivity, you didn't sit there with everything that's kind of feeding you all the time, and there's just not enough time to read everything, do everything, respond to everything. It's a constant dilemma as to how you're prioritizing and what you're actually doing, which I think everyone probably feels. And back to that balance thing, you need to find a way through that and find a sensible balance in what you're doing. That you've got to have your three-legged stool. You've got to have yourself, your family, and your work all in focus on this.
So my consultancy is called the Kingfisher Consulting, and I named it after Lawrence of Arabia, and that famous quote about 9/10 is process, tactics, and procedure, and 1/10 is the kingfisher striking out across the pond. That moment of inspiration, and he writes, that is the art of a general. That's where it comes from. It's the High Command and Staff course piece, isn't it? The Kingfisher.
Yep, it is, absolutely.
I literally stole it straight from there, but I actually fell into it by accident, because I formed a club called the Kingfisher Club, which people listening to this podcast may be members of. But they're basically we formed it as like a near veterans, long-term veterans networking support group in this area. Well, people come down from Gloucester, from Hereford, from Bristol and Salisbury. We had somebody come the other week all the way from Norfolk for 2 hours, which I was really impressed by. A retired 2-star, and it's rank from OF5, OF4, OF5 all the way through to 3 stars. We got a couple of civil servants, and I've got an old MP in there somewhere.
Well, people come together, mostly Army, or you've got a mixture?
There's a bit of Air Force, a bit of Air Force. I think there's two Navy. It's 4 or 5 Air Force actually, because there's quite a lot of group around here. You've got quite a lot of people settled in this part of the world, and really, really good from the point of view of a support network where we get people to come together last Thursday of the month. And if any of your listeners want to, if they're local and they want to join, reach out, more than welcome, because it's a great, and we get people to check in. I get properly to check in and be absolutely authentic about what they're going through. And we use an acronym. WISH, we use the one at the moment, which is wellness, physical, what I'm doing for work, how am I physically and mentally, what am I doing intellectually, which is this I'm watching on Netflix, this is what I'm reading, this is the podcast I'm listening to. S, what am I doing socially or spiritually? And then H is, what do I need help with? And really, really good. And the WhatsApp group is alive all the time with people putting stuff on, their jobs on. I need a financial advisor. Here's the job opportunity. Here's an article. You know what I mean? And really, really good. And so what I found is I guess it's leadership, isn't it? And we did it actually because a couple of people you could see people struggling. You could see 1 or 2 people really struggling with the transition that we've been kind of talking about, because it isn't easy, and better for people to poll up and be honest about where they're at and get some help and see that there's lots of other people around the same than just not do anything.
Yeah, I think it's really good, because I think the other thing is it's the old thing, problem shared is problem halved, and I think the other thing, very, very often, you think, oh my God, I'm going through this terrible drama, and actually there's lots of other people who are in exactly the same place as you, or have been there and have got advice as to how to get through it and how to help you out with it, and so on. So no, I think, well, good for you. That's a terrific initiative. I think it's a really, really, really good idea.
And what I've done is from that, I've got quite a good contract just by chance, network again, with this Canadian investment bank. So I've got people in from the network, from the Kingfisher Club. The
networking thing is so important. I think it's so easily dismissed by lots of people as, oh yeah, whatever, it's just a networking thing. I mean, the reality is, certainly if you're in the portfolio game, for me, pretty much everything is networked. It's all about who's going to turn around and look at you and go, yeah, you might be the right person to go and do this particular piece of work, or I don't know, potentially bigger than that if you're looking for full-time jobs and those sorts of things. So no, hugely important. We touched on the. I always tend to talk about highs and lows a bit. I mean, you touched on the GardaWorld thing being a low. I mean, was it the low, or are there any other the big lows that are worse than that?
Well, I think if you go back and losing people on ops, people dying on the ranges, even, that's
I can equate to
those
that as a
deaths and
horrendous.
funerals and all those sort of things. I mean, yeah, I think there's there've probably been a number of occasions where that which is just hard yards. It's just hard yards. That was our business. That's what we were into, and then it comes back to just making sure you do everything you can to stay connected, with the widows, with the families, even though they'll go through some really hard times. I think that's the difficulties.
Yeah, I think the other thing, I mean, because I absolutely recognise that from Afghanistan as well, where I lost a couple of people at Kandahar. I mean, I think the challenge, and it was the same in the flying world, that the old cliche, the show must go on. It really, because that is the way it is. You don't stop for this stuff. You pause briefly to reflect and so on, but then actually you move on and you're carrying on the charge, and that for some people that's quite hard. And I think that definitely. It's only later potentially that you get the chance to properly think through the impact and kind of what you went through and all the rest of it, which again is not necessarily that easy to do. And as I've done the podcast actually for 2 and a bit years now, I've interviewed quite a few people where mental health and things like that has been a feature of it. And the good thing is, I think we're getting to a better place where people are actually talking about this sort of stuff more and sharing more and so on. But that seems to me so important that people do actually do that, because it's just too easy to not and have a whole load of stored up drama that is somewhere in your life that you've never really exercised in the right way.
I'm really inspired by the British Army's leadership program and this stuff I'm doing at the moment, Sanders. I check in with these candidates. There are 15 this time around, and whenever I do that, I do it with an occupational psychologist. Who absolutely is brilliant. You know what I mean? So they're really, really, and thankfully we're investing the right people at the right place. And then there's others that can bring help in, because this is all about anticipating the problem, not dealing with it after it's.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. Absolutely right.
So that's quite inspiring stuff. I'm really happy to be part of that.
No, yeah, you're right. It's much better if they're doing that. And actually just that whole selection process and kind of trying to evaluate people in a better way, I think has got to be a good thing as well, because I'm not sure that's necessarily the case when I was going through. High points. What's the highest of your high points?
Probably a battle group night attack at Bathurst in Canada. The end of weeks and weeks of training, about to cross the line of departure to go to Iraq on operations, and knowing that all the bullets are going one way. 1,000 men, a couple of hundred vehicles, and it all just goes brilliantly. And just this machine. And then I think that's starts the memory. And then I think 6-7 hard months later, marching the men and women back into the barracks with hundreds and hundreds of families waiting for them. You know what I mean? Happy, a couple of people injured on that particular trip. Nobody killed in action, a couple of people injured, but nobody lost to the enemy. Just wow. I mean, they're probably the highs. And then I think and you'll know this as well as I do, I think then family. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Coming home from Afghan, I'm going to get tears in my eyes, so I need to stop. Going to see my son play rugby at St. George's School in Windsor. I hadn't seen him for 4 months or something.
Yeah, nice.
That was yes.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I was terrified I wouldn't recognise him. I couldn't even figure out what the rugby kit was.
I think
I hadn't been around enough.
I can completely equate to the satisfaction you must have felt from the training piece, going to that very high end training and being fully ready to go on ops, and then actually going on ops and coming back with everybody you set out with. I mean, maybe a couple of chips off the edges, but that's really good, because I mean, so often that's not the case, and and it must have been very, very satisfying. I can completely see where that would be a high point.
Well, and then I think in the context that was Charge of the Knights, that was Basra, and then the whole British failure of the mission. So trying to, there's a whole psychology to that disaster, because we screwed it up big time. You know what I mean? And you're just managing defeat. I was, preparing for this, I saw Viscount Slim's book, Defeat into Victory. That's exactly what it was. Getting rocketed every day, trying to keep morale up.
Yeah, I
Doing,
remember actually the discussion, because obviously I had Royal Air Force Regiment Force Protection doing Kandahar, and we were talking about what had happened in Basra, and the I've got a map on my wall here of all the rocket strikes that took place during my time at CAF, and they're actually, I mean, there are quite a lot of dots on it, but there's, if I'd been in Basra, it would have been a lot more dots, and the rockets were a lot bigger.
every day. It was a
Yeah,
nightmare.
yeah. It was
How we didn't, lose. I just don't, no idea. Luck and great training and good people. So yeah, I think they're the highs, and I think as you get older, isn't it? It's just seeing your family do well. I've got a son who's a detective in the Metropolitan Police. He's just thriving on it, and he was going to follow me into the army, but it was just taking too long. So he's found his feet, and I'm glad and very proud of him.
Nice, yeah, absolutely.
When he phones me up and tells me stories, he's just done a drugs bust, or he's just arrested somebody for attempted murder or something like that. Then
Okay,
been involved in some car chase. Then
must be challenging too, though, for him. I mean, that's a whole separate conversation. But given the kind of all the stuff around them, particularly the Met Police, and because I think that's an organisation where they've really had to work through some hard yards. They do some amazing stuff, but you've got some really nasty, very obviously bad apple stories that have come out and played out so badly in the public. That's got to be quite tough to take if you're doing.
Yeah, he's in the new generation, and he speaks very highly of the commissioner Mark Rowley and the leadership teams. They've still got drama. He calls them the old bill. They've still got people there that are old bill. They've got a culture challenge, but he's encouraged. So, although I haven't said that, 15 in his cohort went in. I think there are 2 left, which is
wow.
Good. 3 years later. It's just tough. It's hard yards,
Yeah, no, I've been, well, as will you have been, I'm sure you've been out with the police a number of times. I mean, it is always very rewarding, very insightful, but also, quite jaw-dropping, really, some of the time. And when you look at what they have to do, it's incredible.
Yeah.
Getting towards the end, but there's a question or two that I still want to get to. I mean, you obviously had all your time in the military, then you had your time, not least at GardaWorld. And when you look at the geopolitics beyond the kind of individual stuff, and you look at the kind of world we're in at the minute, and you, having done so much NATO work, which we didn't talk about in depth, but you did a number of big NATO jobs. I'm just really interested in your perspectives on that whole kind of collective sort of set of stuff that's out there, and what you're seeing, what your thought process is about. Where are we at the heading into a really bad place? Have we got a way forward out of it? Have we what are you thinking?
Yeah, I think we're in a really dangerous place, to be honest. And if I was still serving, I'd be preparing for war. I'd definitely be leading and be preparing for a fight. That's what the indicators would be in my view. It's not going the right way, and then you've got so much uncertainty being created by the political leaderships across the and I'm pretty apolitical even still, because I think we've just learned to be that way. But sometimes I call it the naivety or the the spontaneity it's quite disappointing, and you can see the risk of a miscalculation, the risk of an error, that triggers something is really, really quite significant, and I think we're in a really difficult place, and I think the hold on us to just do what we can. That's why I'm enjoying working at Sandhurst. Just it's only 15 days a year, but at least I get to try and help these people that might be in this fight. Really, really significant. And I think I talked to you about the Cynefin model and context, and it's much more complex and chaotic than it's ever been. Much more complex and chaotic than ever been, and I think there's a requirement for really good leadership, and we're not seeing it. Moral, values based, across the piece. And when look, and you hurt when the media's just, look at the Prince Andrew drama. What a distraction!
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I just feel, when our most upstanding institution is getting trashed because of, there's It's really, really hard. And I think the generation that's following us, I don't think it's going to be easy. And if I reflect on my career, and when I joined the army, it was Northern Ireland and Germany. If you'd had said to me 36 years later that I would have toured the world, been involved in so many bus stops, Bosnia, Kosovo, Iraq, Afghanistan, numerous times. You know what I mean? I would have laughed, would have said, I think that's what we're into, but even worse.
Yeah, I agree, and I share your view in large part. And I think the bit that is most concerning purely from a UK point of view, but I think you could translate it to a number of other Western countries as well, where I just don't think we are thinking from a public point of view, despite all the connectivity, all the information, all the kind of instant, constant news feed and everything else. I just don't think we're in a space where people kind of are feeling the imminence of something that could go wrong. I mean, I did a podcast the other day with Lord George Robertson, obviously former Secretary General of NATO. Hugely well placed to do this. He's met and sat down, had talks with Putin and things. So fascinating guy, and he shares this view. He said, the reality is that we're not feeling it as we need to feel it, and we're not ready to make the sacrifices that we probably need to make from a financial point of view and a kind of in the country to provide the right kind of security framework. And it's not just about hard power defense. It's about, critical national infrastructure and the potential loss of everything that, enables us to function. If you lose the banking system, if you lose the electricity grid, if you lose all the just-in-time supply chain, all those kind of things, which I think are really, really threatening. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to finish on a too gloomy a note, but I think that is it is definitely a really, really challenging time. And I hope we do find a better way through it. But I mean, by goodness, it looks as though it's going to be tricky.
I think the Deborah Haynes podcast, War Game, I don't know if you listened to it yet.
Yeah, really good.
Highly recommended to listeners. Richard Barnes is superb. Ben Wallace is superb. Who was CGO? Just forgotten his name. But anyway, they're all really good and so realistic.
Oh, it was David Capewell, wasn't it?
David Capewell, absolutely brilliant.
The fact they had real people who have done those jobs, playing that, and again, it does paints a stark picture. But it was actually, it is, as you say, it's something that people should listen to, just because it gives you some perspective on where stuff might go, and we're definitely not in a comfortable place at the minute.
Yeah, no, and if the role of the leadership is to protect, that's the most important thing, then.
Yeah, I need to think about it.
Think about it.
Yeah, no, too right. Last question, very last question, which is one I always ask. What's the most difficult question you've ever been asked?
Why did my son die? Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that would be tough. Yeah, was that from somebody you lost on ops?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, go way back in my case. Northern Ireland was the first time. Yeah, but that's kind of,
Yeah, really hard. No, those kind of things I think are particularly difficult for sure. Gary, you've been a star. I know you've got to go, and need to let you go and catch your train. But thank you very, very much indeed. It's been really fascinating. We could have talked for a lot longer for sure, but I loved it. Really interesting.
Brilliant, Bob. Thank you very much indeed. I hope everyone enjoys the listen. I'll certainly listen to myself.
Yeah, take care.
Great, catch up real soon. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Bye now. I really hope you've enjoyed what I think was a great conversation with Gary. So many interesting insights from him, so many areas of common ground, obviously from our sort of shared background, as it were, but also some really nuanced, different things that I think he comes out with. So, if you find it useful, please share it, please comment on it, please send feedback, please like it, repost it, do all those kind of things that help get the podcast a bit bigger and a bit better. If you really find it valuable, then as I always say, then please do think about subscribing and becoming a financial supporter to the show via Patreon, either via the support the show link in your podcast platform, or going to patreon.com, www.patreon.com/leading4life. And you can find the opportunity there to join up at various different levels and be a supporter. And if you do that, it will be making a big difference to what I do, and that will really, really help. But I'm delighted, as always, just to have you listening anyway or watching anyway, and keep doing that. Thank you very much indeed, and we'll be back very soon with some more great content. Speak soon. Bye now.